They said it couldn't be done. Single-engine fighters didn't have the range to reach Japan from any land base America controlled. The distance was too great, the logistics too complex, the fuel consumption too high. But on April 7, 1945, 91 P-51D Mustangs proved them wrong. They launched from Iwo Jima, a speck of volcanic rock 750 miles south of Tokyo that Marines had captured just weeks earlier at terrible cost. They flew north over open ocean with no alternate landing sites, navigating by dead reckoning and timing. They climbed to 25,000 feet, rendezvoused with B-29 bombers, and escorted them over Tokyo itself. When Japanese pilots looked up and saw silver American fighters over their capital, the psychological impact was immediate. These weren't carrier-based Navy planes with limited range. These were land-based Army fighters that had crossed an ocean to be here, and they still had enough fuel to fight and fly home. The terror Japanese pilots felt wasn't about the dogfight to come. It was about what those Mustangs represented. An industrial system so powerful it had made the impossible routine. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. Dawn, April 7th, 1945. Tokyo. Air raid sirens wail across the city as radar operators track incoming contacts from the south. The pattern is familiar. B-29 superfortresses approaching for another daylight raid. Scramble orders go out to every operational airfield within range of the capital. At Narimasu Airfield, pilots sprint toward their fighters. Some climb into Ki-84 Hayates, Japan's newest and fastest interceptor. Others settle for older Ki-43 Hayabusas or whatever aircraft remains serviceable. The briefing is simple. Intercept the bomber formation before it reaches Tokyo. Attack from head-on where the B-29s are most vulnerable. Avoid the tail guns. No one mentions escort fighters. Because escort fighters from land bases don't exist, not at this distance. The Americans have carriers, yes, but carrier aircraft lack the endurance for prolonged combat over the mainland. The ocean itself is Japan's defensive barrier. 750 miles of water that no single-engine fighter can cross with enough fuel remaining to fight. The pilots know this. Their commanders have assured them of this, then they see them. Silver shapes cutting through the morning haze at 25,000 feet, not the bulky silhouettes of B-29s, but sleek single-engine fighters with distinctive bubble canopies catching the early light. Flying in formation, escorting the bombers, P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo, the disbelief is visceral. Lieutenant Naoshi Kano, climbing through 15,000 feet in his Ki-84, recalls the moment in his diary, "I thought my eyes were deceiving me." American fighters? Here? It was impossible. We were told they couldn't reach us, that Iwo Jima was too far, that we were safe from their fighters. Flight Officer Saburo Sakai, a veteran with hundreds of combat hours, sees them and immediately understands what his squadron mates haven't grasped yet. The war was already over. We just didn't know it yet. Because if American fighters could reach Tokyo, if they could cross 750 miles of ocean, arrive with fuel to fight, and still have enough to return home, then distance meant nothing anymore. The defensive calculations Japan had based its entire strategy on were obsolete. The sky belonged to America now, and every pilot climbing toward those silver Mustangs knew in that moment of recognition that they were fighting a war that had already been lost. The numbers told the story before the first shot was fired. Iwo Jima after Tokyo, 750 statute miles, entirely over water, no emergency landing sites, no navigational landmarks until Mount Fuji appeared on the horizon, just ocean, a compass heading, and precise fuel calculations that left zero margin for error. 2 years earlier, this mission existed only in theoretical planning documents filed away as tactically infeasible. The P-38 Lightning had the range but couldn't maintain formation with B-29s at altitude. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a magnificent fighter but drank fuel like a sinking ship took on water. The Navy's carrier fighters could reach the Japanese coast, but only for brief strikes before racing back to their ships. The math simply didn't work. Then came Iwo Jima. Marines paid for that 8-square-mile island with 6,821 dead and 19,117 wounded over 36 days of savage fighting. They captured it not for its strategic value as an island, but for its airfields, runways that would put single-engine fighters within striking distance of Tokyo for the first time in the war. Within weeks of the island's capture, Seabees had extended the runways and built fuel storage facilities. By late March 1945, P-51 Mustangs of the 7th Fighter Command began arriving. The tactical mathematics had fundamentally changed. April 7th marked the proof. 91 Mustangs took off from Iwo Jima's south field beginning at 05:45 hours, each carrying two 110-gallon drop tanks slung beneath the wings. Total fuel capacity 449 gallons, estimated consumption for the round trip 460 gallons. That left 29 gallons for combat maneuvering, roughly 12 minutes of fighting at high power settings. 12 minutes to decide the battle. The pilots flew north at economical cruise settings, around 1,850 RPM and 28 inches of manifold pressure, which gave them approximately 180 miles per hour true airspeed while consuming just 65 gallons per hour. The Merlin engine's two-stage supercharger automatically compensated for altitude, maintaining power as they climbed. Navigation was executed by dead reckoning and radio compass, with flight leaders timing each leg to the second. Missed the rendezvous with the bombers by even 15 minutes, and the entire mission collapsed. The B-29s wouldn't wait. They couldn't. Their own fuel consumption was calculated to the gallon. At 06:45 hours, Mount Fuji appeared exactly where the navigation calculations predicted. Its snow-capped volcanic cones served as a massive visual confirmation. They were on course, on time, on altitude. At 06:55 hours, the bomber stream came into view. 103 B-29 superfortresses of the 73rd Bomb Wing arranged in combat boxes, their aluminum skin glinting in the morning sun. The rendezvous was perfect. Then came the coast of Honshu. Crossing from ocean to land, the Mustang pilots toggled their drop tank release. 182 aluminum tanks tumbled away, glinting as they fell. Some exploded on an impact, others bounced across rice paddies or crashed through farmhouse roofs. Each empty tank represented 110 gallons of fuel consumed and 220 pounds of weight shed. The Mustangs were lighter now, faster, more maneuverable, and they still had 184 gallons of internal fuel remaining, enough to escort the bombers to their targets, fight their way out, and fly 750 miles home. The impossible had become routine. The P-51D Mustang wasn't just better than its opponents, it represented a different philosophy of air warfare entirely. Where other fighters optimized for single attributes, speed or maneuverability or firepower, the Mustang achieved something unprecedented. It excelled at everything simultaneously. And it did so through engineering decisions that compounded advantages rather than trading one capability for another. Start with the heart, the Packard V1657 engine. This was a license-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66, and it transformed the Mustang from a good fighter into an exceptional one. The engine delivered 1,095 horsepower at takeoff, with water injection rising to 1,720 horsepower in emergency war power settings, but raw power was only part of the equation. The real advantage lay in the two-stage, two-speed supercharger. Most fighters used single-stage superchargers that compressed incoming air once before feeding it to the engine. This worked adequately at low altitudes, but became progressively less effective as air density decreased. By 25,000 feet, Japanese engines with single-stage superchargers were gasping, their power output dropping precipitously. The Merlin's two-stage system compressed the air twice, first in a low-pressure stage, then in a high-pressure stage, maintaining engine performance at altitudes where enemy aircraft could barely function. At 25,000 feet, where a Ki-84's engine produced perhaps 1,200 horsepower on good fuel, the Mustang's Merlin was still generating over 1,500 horsepower. The supercharger automatically shifted between low and high blower settings as altitude increased, maintaining optimal boost pressure without pilot intervention. Climbed to 18,000 feet and the transition happened seamlessly. The pilot felt a slight surge in power, heard the pitch of the engine change subtly, and continued climbing. Japanese pilots had no equivalent system. Their single-stage superchargers meant that altitude advantage belonged entirely to the Americans. Then came the wing. Edgar Schmood's laminar flow design wasn't just aerodynamically elegant, it was mathematically superior. Traditional wings generated turbulent airflow over much of their surface, creating parasitic drag that required power to overcome. Schmood's design maintained smooth laminar airflow over 60% of the wing's surface by carefully controlling the thickness distribution and camber. The result, 35% less drag than conventional airfoils. Less drag meant better fuel efficiency. Better fuel efficiency meant longer range. Longer range meant the Mustang could fly 750 miles, fight, and fly home, something no other single-engine fighter in the world could accomplish. The wing also provided exceptional high-altitude performance. At 25,000 feet, where Japanese fighters struggled, the Mustang remained responsive and maneuverable. At 30,000 feet, where Ki-84s could barely maintain level flight, Mustangs could still dogfight. Finally, the firepower. 6 M2 Browning 40-caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing. Firing rate 800 rounds per minute per gun. Total output 4,800 rounds per minute. That's 80 rounds per second converging on a single point. Each round weighed 46 grams and left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second. The kinetic energy was devastating, capable of punching through engine blocks, severing control cables, igniting fuel tanks, and shredding airframes. A 1-second burst put 80 rounds into the target. Most aircraft couldn't survive that. A 2-second burst, 160 rounds, was catastrophic. Japanese fighters carried cannons with superior individual round lethality, but the math favored the Mustang. A Ki-84's 30mm cannon held 50 rounds per gun. Fire for 3 seconds and the gun was empty. The Mustang's 50 calibers carried between 270 and 500 rounds per gun, enough for sustained combat. This was the source of fear, not a single advantage, but a system of compounding advantages that made defeat inevitable. Paper, the Nakajima. Ki-84 Hayate should have been competitive. Japan's engineers weren't incompetent. They understood aerodynamics, metallurgy, and engine design. The Ki-84, designated Frank by Allied intelligence, represented their best thinking, incorporating lessons learned from 3 years of brutal combat across the Pacific. The specifications were impressive. Maximum speed of 388 mph in level flight, climbing to 427 mph under ideal conditions with high-octane fuel and perfect engine tuning. Rate of climb, 3,790 feet per minute. Service ceiling, 34,150 feet. Armament, 2 30mm HO-155 cannons and 2 20mm HO-5 cannons, capable of destroying a B-29 with a single well-placed burst. In early 1944, test pilots reported that the Ki-84 could outclimb and outmaneuver both the P-51 Mustang and the P-47 Thunderbolt at certain altitudes and speeds. The aircraft was agile, fast, and heavily armed. Japan had designed a world-class fighter, but they couldn't build it. The Nakajima Ho-45 Homari engine was the first casualty of Japan's industrial collapse. This 18-cylinder radial represented ambitious engineering, fuel injection, water methanol boost, precise tolerances that promised 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. In practice, the Homari was a maintenance nightmare that grew worse with every passing month. The engine required machining tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Japanese factories, operating under constant B-29 bombardment and increasingly desperate material shortages, couldn't maintain those standards. Cylinder heads warped. Piston rings wore unevenly, valve timing drifted out of specification. Pilots reported engines that ran rough from the moment they started. Power output varied wildly between individual aircraft. One Ki-84 might produce close to rated horsepower, while the one beside it on the flight line struggled to generate. Mechanics never knew what they were getting. Worse, engines failed catastrophically in flight. Pistons seized, connecting rods snapped, entire cylinder heads cracked and separated. A pilot might take off with an engine that seemed adequate only to have it disintegrate at full combat power when his life depended on it. The landing gear failures were almost as deadly. Japanese steel quality had deteriorated so badly that heat treatment became unreliable. Landing gear struts that should have been hardened to specific tolerances contained impurities that made proper hardening impossible. The struts looked correct, measured correctly, but collapsed under stress. Pilots returning from combat missions, already exhausted, low on fuel, possibly wounded, touched down and watched their landing gear crumple. The aircraft cartwheeled, broke apart, burned. Japan lost fighters and irreplaceable pilots not to enemy action, but to metallurgical failure. Then came the fuel crisis. American Mustang pilots flew on 100-octane aviation gasoline refined in Texas and California, fuel specifically formulated for high-performance engines. Japanese pilots made do with whatever could be synthesized domestically. By 1945, aviation fuel quality had collapsed to 87 octane or lower, sometimes 80 octane. The Homari engine, designed for high-octane fuel, suffered severe pre-ignition that destroyed cylinders and pistons. Desperate units mixed pine root oil, sweet potato alcohol, and sake production byproducts into their fuel. Engines that barely ran on proper fuel couldn't function on improvised substitutes. Pilots reported that some Ki-84s couldn't reach 25,000 feet, the altitude where combat with B-29s and their escorts occurred. The engines simply didn't have enough power on degraded fuel to climb higher. Japan had produced 3,514 Ki-84s by war's end. Perhaps half were operational at any given time. Of those, maybe half again were truly combat-ready. They had designed a competitive fighter, but industrial collapse meant they couldn't field it. By April 1945, Japan's most dangerous weapon, experienced combat pilots, had been systematically destroyed. The veterans who had opened the war over Pearl Harbor and dominated the skies in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies were gone. Shot down over Rabaul, lost at Midway, killed in the grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign. Expended in the desperate battles over the Philippines where Japan threw everything it had left into stopping the American advance. Those pilots had accumulated thousands of flight hours and hundreds of combat missions. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, and how to exploit an opponent's mistakes. They could coax performance from marginal aircraft and make split-second tactical decisions that kept them alive. They were irreplaceable. And they were dead. What remained were teenagers, boys of 17, 18, 19, pulled from schools and given abbreviated training before being thrust into cockpits and told to stop the American war machine. Flight Officer Toshimitsu Imaizumi was 19 years old when he first encountered P-51s over Tokyo. His total flight time, 140 hours. His combat experience, 0 missions. By comparison, the average American fighter pilot arriving in the Pacific in 1945 had logged over 400 flight hours before his first combat mission. Many had 600 hours or more. They had trained on the actual aircraft they would fly in combat. They had fired their guns at towed targets until they could judge deflection instinctively. The Japanese replacements often had fewer than 100 hours total flight time. Some had never fired their guns in training. Ammunition was too precious to waste on practice. They learned gunnery principles from classroom lectures and hoped they could apply them under combat stress. Many died on their first mission. Some didn't survive their first encounter. They simply lacked the experience to recognize danger developing, to manage energy in a dogfight, to know when to break off an attack that had no chance of success. The tactical consequences were devastating. Japanese formations that should have pressed coordinated attacks instead hesitated. Inexperienced pilots saw the Mustangs' defensive formations and didn't know how to penetrate them. They made tentative passes from too far away, burning precious ammunition without effect, then broke off when return fire got close. The veterans would have known better. They would have coordinated attacks from multiple angles, forced the Americans to split their attention, exploited any gap in the escort coverage. The replacements didn't have that knowledge. They had enthusiasm and courage, but courage without skill is just a faster path to death. Ammunition shortages made everything worse. Even when pilots achieved firing position, they often had only 50 rounds per cannon, perhaps 3 seconds of fire. Miss with that burst and there was no second chance. The pressure was immense. One opportunity, one trigger pull, and the knowledge that wasting ammunition meant returning to base with nothing accomplished. Some pilots froze. Others fired from too far away, watched their tracers arc uselessly past the target, and realized they'd exhausted their ammunition without scoring a single hit. The psychological weight was crushing. These young pilots understood they were facing opponents with better aircraft, better training, better logistics, and overwhelming numerical superiority. Every mission was likely their last. Every takeoff might be the one they didn't return from. Flight Officer Yasuhiko Kuroe, age 18, wrote in his diary the night before his final mission, "I do not fear death. I fear dying without purpose. We cannot win. We can only die. I pray my death will mean something." He was shot down the next morning by a P-51 Mustang. His first combat mission, his last. This was the human cost of industrial collapse, not just inadequate aircraft, but pilots sent to die in them. The engagement began at 25,000 feet. It ended at every altitude below that. Japanese interceptors approached in loose formations, Ki-84s leading, older Ki-43s and Ki-44s following, Navy fighters struggling to keep pace. They intended coordinated attacks from multiple angles, the tactics that had worked in 1942 when Japanese pilots held the qualitative edge. Those tactics required altitude advantage. They didn't have it. The Mustangs held the high ground at 27,000 feet, positioned between the sun and the Japanese fighters climbing to meet them. At that altitude, the P-51's Merlin engine was still producing over 1,500 horsepower. The Ki-84's Homari was generating perhaps 200 horsepower on degraded fuel. If it was running properly at all, the mathematics of vertical combat are unforgiving. An aircraft with better altitude performance can choose when and where to engage. It dives, builds speed, makes a firing pass, then climbs back to altitude using energy gained in the dive. The opponent below must either accept the attack or try to climb to meet it, which bleeds energy and leaves them vulnerable. The Mustangs dove. Silver fighters dropped from above in pairs, building speed to over 450 mph. They closed to 300 yards, fired 2-second bursts, 160 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition converging on single targets, then pulled up sharply, using their speed to climb back and above the engagement. Japanese pilots tried to turn into the attacks, tried to bring their heavier cannons to bear, but turning bleeds energy, and they were already energy poor, struggling to maintain altitude, their engines laboring in the thin air. A Ki-84 tried to follow a Mustang's climb, made it perhaps 2,000 feet before its airspeed dropped below sustainable flight. The aircraft stalled, fell away. The Mustang pilot rolled inverted at the top of his climb, spotted the stalled fighter below, and dove again. Kill ratios tell the story. April 7th, 21 Japanese aircraft confirmed destroyed, 7 probables, 4 damaged. American losses, 2 P-51s, 1 to ground fire, 1 to unknown causes. Not a single Mustang lost in air-to-air combat. April 12th, 28 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 3 American losses. April 16th, 37 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 4 American losses. The pattern repeated across every mission. Japanese losses in double digits, American losses in single digits or 0. This wasn't a contest, it was systematic destruction. Japanese formations unraveled under pressure. Coordinated attacks require communication, timing, and mutual support. The inexperienced pilots couldn't maintain formation under fire. One element would break away early, another would hesitate. The attack that should have come from 3 directions simultaneously arrived piecemeal. 1 fighter at a time, each easily countered by the Mustang's defensive formations. Individual Japanese pilots showed courage. They pressed attacks despite overwhelming odds. They dove through American formations hoping to reach the B-29s. Some succeeded, briefly. Most died trying. The altitude gap made everything worse. Japanese fighters that survived the initial engagement found themselves scattered across 15,000 feet of vertical airspace. Some at 25,000 feet trying to maintain altitude. Others at 15,000 feet after diving away from attacks. Still others at 10,000 feet damaged and descending. Regrouping was nearly impossible. By the time survivors located each other, the Mustangs had repositioned, regained altitude advantage, and were ready to attack again. The outcome was never in doubt, not because Japanese pilots lacked courage. They fought until their ammunition was exhausted or their aircraft too damaged to continue. Not because they lacked skill. The veterans among them understood air combat as well as any pilot alive. They lost because they were fighting a system designed to win through overwhelming material advantage. Better engines, better fuel, better training, better logistics. The sky belonged to America. Tokyo's defenders could only die trying to reclaim it. The real battle wasn't happening over Tokyo, it was happening 6,000 miles away in Texas. Refineries, California factories, and across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, every gallon of 100-octane aviation fuel that powered the Mustangs over Japan began as crude oil pumped from American wells, refined in American facilities, loaded onto American tankers, and shipped across an ocean the U.S. Navy had turned into an American highway. The fuel arrived at Iwo Jima in a steady stream, tankers offloading into storage tanks the Seabees had constructed within days of the island's capture. Fuel trucks rolled continuously between storage facilities and flight lines. No Mustang ever sat grounded waiting for fuel. The supply was effectively infinite. Japan's fuel came from coal liquefaction plants that produced inferior synthetic gasoline under constant B-29 bombardment. What little petroleum Japan still controlled had to be shipped through submarine-infested waters from the Dutch East Indies. Most tankers never made it. By April 1945, Japan's aviation fuel production had collapsed to roughly 10% of 1944 levels. American pilots flew on optimal fuel. Japanese pilots flew on whatever wouldn't destroy their engines immediately, and sometimes it did anyway. Spare parts told the same story. A Mustang's Merlin engine was rated for approximately 300 hours between overhauls under combat conditions. When an engine reached that limit, mechanics simply removed it, installed a fresh one from stock, and sent the aircraft back to combat. The removed engine went to a depot for rebuild. The entire process took hours. Parts flowed from American factories in quantities that seemed impossible. Propellers, magnetos, supercharger components, gun barrels, landing gear assemblies, anything that wore out or broke could be replaced immediately. Japanese mechanics scavenged parts from destroyed aircraft to keep flying ones operational. They jury-rigged repairs with improvised materials. They pushed engines far beyond safe operational limits because replacement engines didn't exist. When a Ki-84's Homare engine failed, that aircraft was often grounded permanently. There was no replacement engine to install. Even the ocean became an American asset. Submarines patrolled the routes between Iwo Jima and Japan, not to attack shipping, but to rescue downed pilots. A Mustang pilot who had to ditch could activate his emergency radio, deploy his life raft, and wait. Chances were good that a submarine would surface within hours, pick him up, and return him to Iwo Jima. The submarines carried emergency medical supplies, food, fresh water, and weather reporting equipment. They radioed weather data back to Iwo Jima, helping mission planners route strikes around dangerous fronts. Japanese pilots who went down over the ocean drowned. There was no rescue network, no submarines waiting, no hope. Weather intelligence revealed the same disparity. American meteorologists on Iwo Jima received data from reconnaissance aircraft, submarines, weather stations across the Pacific, and even captured Japanese weather reports. They could predict conditions over Tokyo with reasonable accuracy, routing missions to avoid the worst weather and maximize bombing effectiveness. Japan's weather forecasting had degraded to observation from the ground and guesswork. Pilots took off not knowing what conditions they'd encounter at altitude. This was the invisible war, the one that determined outcomes before the first shot was fired. Japan couldn't produce enough fuel, couldn't manufacture enough spare parts, couldn't maintain quality control, couldn't rescue downed pilots, couldn't predict weather accurately, couldn't ship materials without them being sunk. Every logistical failure compounded. Fewer operational aircraft meant fewer pilots got combat experience. Worse fuel meant more engine failures, no spare parts meant cannibalization of aircraft, no rescue network meant experienced pilots were lost permanently when they could have been saved. America's logistical system didn't just support the war effort, it was the war effort. The Mustangs over Tokyo were just the visible tip of an industrial spear that stretched back across the Pacific, across America, into factories, refineries, and training bases that operated 24 hours a day, producing the material that made victory inevitable. Japan was fighting a war. America was running a system. The terror wasn't limited to the cockpit. When silver Mustangs appeared over Tokyo, circling at altitudes Japanese interceptors could barely reach, the psychological impact radiated outward like shockwaves from a bomb. Pilots saw it first, then ground crews, then civilians watching from streets and rooftops. Finally, the realization reached those who had promised it could never happen: the military leadership itself. Flight Officer Ryoji Ohara wrote in his diary on April 10th, 3 days after the first escort mission, "We were told the homeland was safe, that American fighters could not reach us. That distance protected Japan. Today I watched P-51s circle over the Imperial Palace itself. They did not hurry. They did not fear. They flew as though they owned the sky, because they do. We scrambled. We climbed as high as our engines would take us. It was not high enough. It is never high enough. How do you fight an enemy that can appear anywhere, anytime, and leave when they choose?" The symbolism of fighters over the Imperial Palace was devastating. For centuries, the palace had been untouchable, sacred ground, protected by tradition, geography, and military might. Now, American fighters circled above it in broad daylight, their contrails visible from the streets below. Some pilots deliberately flew low enough that civilians could see the white stars on their wings. The message was clear: nowhere is safe, nothing is sacred, we can reach anything we choose. Civilian Michiko Yamamoto, age 16, recorded her observations. "Mother told us not to look at the sky, but we looked anyway. The American fighters were so high they left white trails behind them, beautiful and terrible. Our fighters rose to meet them and fell, every time. Father stopped listening to the radio broadcasts. He said they were lies. He said the war was already lost and our leaders would not admit it. The collapse of faith in leadership was perhaps the most corrosive effect. Japanese military authorities had built their credibility on promises that Japan's fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages, that the homeland would be defended, that sacrifice would bring victory. The Mustangs over Tokyo exposed every promise as hollow. Lieutenant Saburo Endo's diary entry from April 16th. "The briefing officer tells us we are winning, that each American aircraft we destroy brings victory closer. I have flown 11 missions. I have seen 30 of our aircraft shot down. I have seen perhaps 3 American fighters fall. The mathematics are simple. We are not winning. We are dying. The briefing officer knows this. We know he knows, but we sit in the briefing room and pretend together because the alternative, admitting the truth, means acknowledging that our deaths will mean nothing." Pilots stopped believing they could win. They flew because orders required it, because refusing meant dishonor, because their culture demanded sacrifice even when sacrifice served no purpose. The psychological weight became unbearable. Some pilots developed what would later be recognized as combat fatigue. Trembling hands, inability to sleep, emotional numbness. Others became reckless, pressing hopeless attacks because dying quickly seemed preferable to dying slowly over dozens of missions. Ground crews watched the toll accumulate. Mechanics who prepared aircraft each morning knew the statistics. They knew that statistically, each pilot would fly perhaps a dozen missions before being killed. They knew the teenager climbing into the cockpit might not return. They said nothing. They simply performed their duties and watched young men die. Chief Mechanic Hiroshi Nakamura. We stopped learning their names. It hurt less that way. A pilot would arrive, fly 3 missions, and be gone. Another would replace him, then another. The faces changed, but the outcome never did. We maintained the aircraft perfectly, but perfect maintenance cannot overcome impossible odds. By late April, the psychological defeat was complete. Japanese pilots still flew, still fought, still died, but they no longer believed victory was possible. They flew to delay defeat, to preserve honor, to fulfill duty. The terror they felt wasn't fear of death, it was the understanding that their deaths would change nothing. The missions continued through May and into June, but something had changed. The Japanese interceptors that once rose to meet every American formation grew fewer with each passing week. Not because pilots lacked courage had never been the issue, but because Japan simply ran out of everything required to sustain air combat: fuel, spare parts, ammunition, experienced pilots, hope. On May 25th, 101 P-51s escorted B-29s to Tokyo. 51 Japanese fighters scrambled. Half turned back due to engine failures before reaching the American formation. Of those that engaged, 8 were shot down. The Mustangs returned to Iwo Jima without loss. The pattern repeated on May 29th, June 1st, June 5th. Fewer Japanese fighters each time. Briefer engagements, longer intervals between enemy contact. By mid-June, some Mustang formations flew entire missions without seeing a single Japanese interceptor. Weather proved more dangerous than the enemy. June 5th, 1945, a massive weather front developed between Iwo Jima and Japan. Towering thunderheads reaching above 40,000 feet, turbulence violent enough to tear aircraft apart, visibility near zero inside the clouds. The mission launched anyway. 27 P-51s entered the weather, 3 never emerged. No enemy contact, no combat damage, just weather that exceeded the aircraft's structural limits or disoriented pilots who lost spatial awareness in the clouds and spun into the ocean. Lieutenant James Brooks radioed that his artificial horizon had failed, that he was in clouds with no visual reference, that his instruments conflicted with his physical sensations. His transmission cut off mid-sentence. Search aircraft found nothing. Weather killed more American pilots in June than Japanese fighters did. The last American pilot killed in air-to-air combat over Japan fell on June 22nd. Second Lieutenant Robert Maxwell, 21st Fighter Group, was escorting B-29s near Osaka when a lone Ki-84 made a head-on pass at the bomber formation. Maxwell broke formation to intercept witnesses, reported seeing both aircraft firing, then the Mustang trailing smoke, descending in a controlled glide toward the coast. Maxwell's last radio transmission: "I'm hit, engines quit, going to try for the water." A submarine searched the area for 3 days. They never found him. The Japanese pilot who shot him down, identity unknown, may have been the last Japanese fighter pilot to score a confirmed kill against a Mustang over Japan. There is no record of him surviving the war. By early July, Japanese resistance had effectively ceased. Not because they surrendered. Japan would not formally surrender until August 15th. But because there was nothing left to fight with. Operational aircraft numbered in the dozens rather than hundreds. Fuel stocks were nearly exhausted. The pilots who remained were either untrained teenagers with 10 hours flight time or exhausted veterans flying their 50th mission on aircraft held together with improvised repairs. July 14th, 150 P-51s escorted B-29s to Tokyo. 0 Japanese fighters intercepted. July 28th, 132 P-51s escorted the bomber stream deep into Honshu. 0 Japanese fighters rose to meet them. August 2nd, the Mustangs flew unopposed. The silence was haunting. American pilots who had spent months watching Japanese fighters climb to meet them, who had developed grudging respect for the courage of pilots fighting an obsolete aircraft with inadequate support, found the absence disturbing. Captain Robert Scott, 45th Fighter Squadron. It was eerie. We'd cross the coast expecting contact and there was nothing. Empty sky. We'd orbit over Tokyo waiting for interceptors that never came. You almost wanted them to appear just to know someone was still fighting. The silence felt wrong. The war continued. The Mustangs flew. The B-29s dropped their bombs. But the air battle was over, not ended by a decisive final engagement or dramatic last stand, but by the slow, grinding collapse of an industrial system that could no longer sustain combat operations. The sky belonged to America. Japan's defenders were simply no longer there to contest it. The numbers tell the story that emotion cannot. Between April 7th and August 14th, 1945, American P-51 Mustangs flew over 10,000 sorties from Iwo Jima to the Japanese home islands. They escorted B-29 bombers to Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of smaller cities. They engaged Japanese interceptors in hundreds of air battles across 4 months of continuous operations. American losses: 91 P-51s, most to weather, mechanical failure, or ground fire. Fewer than 30 to enemy fighters. Japanese losses: over 600 aircraft confirmed destroyed in air-to-air combat, hundreds more damaged or written off, thousands of pilots killed. The kill ratio, roughly 20-1, wasn't the result of superior American courage. Japanese pilots fought with desperate bravery until they had nothing left to fight with. The ratio reflected industrial capacities translated into battlefield dominance. North American aviation produced 15,586 P-51s during the war. Japan produced 3,514 Ki-84 Hayats, their most advanced fighter, in the same period. America built more of one aircraft type than Japan built of all fighter types combined in the war's final 2 years, and American aircraft were built better, maintained better, fueled better, and flown by better trained pilots, supported by a logistics system that functioned flawlessly across 6,000 miles of ocean. A damaged Mustang that made it back to Iwo Jima could be repaired in hours or days. Parts arrived continuously. Mechanics had tools, manuals, and replacement components. The aircraft returned to combat. A damaged Ki-84 that limped back to its base was often cannibalized for parts to keep other aircraft flying. There were no replacement engines, no spare propellers, no reliable supply chain. The aircraft sat grounded, slowly stripped of usable components until only the airframe remained. Survivability determined everything. An American pilot shot down over the ocean could expect rescue. Submarines patrolled the flight routes. Survival rates for downed pilots were approximately 50%, remarkable for overwater operations. A Japanese pilot shot down over the ocean drowned. There was no rescue, no second chance. When Japan lost a pilot, he was gone, permanently. His experience, his training, his knowledge died with him. By June 1945, Japan had run out of both aircraft and pilots, not because they couldn't train new pilots, they tried desperately, but because the industrial system required to sustain modern air warfare had collapsed completely. The Mustang's legacy extended far beyond the Pacific. It proved that long-range fighter escort was not only possible, but decisive. It demonstrated that air superiority could be achieved and maintained through industrial production rather than individual pilot skill. It showed that range, the ability to appear anywhere, anytime, was itself a weapon that psychological impact equal to firepower. Japanese pilots were terrified not because the P-51 was unbeatable in a dogfight. Skilled pilots in Ki-84s occasionally shot them down, but because the Mustang represented a form of warfare they could not counter. They were fighting individual battles. America was running a system when Japanese pilots looked up on April 7th, 1945, and saw silver fighters over Tokyo, fighters that shouldn't exist at that distance, that couldn't theoretically be there. They understood instantly what their commanders would not admit for 4 more months. Distance no longer protected Japan. The ocean was no longer a barrier. American industrial might could project power anywhere it chose, sustain it indefinitely, and overwhelm any defense through sheer material superiority. The sky belonged to America. The war was over. Japan's pilots knew it the moment they saw Mustangs over Tokyo. The rest was just mathematics, brutal, inevitable, and complete. They were terrified because they were watching their own defeat become certain, one silver fighter at a time.